The squad car's blue and red lights painted harsh shadows across my gravel driveway as Deputy Martinez stepped out, his hand resting casually on his radio. Behind him, Karen Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at my dusty pickup truck, like she was identifying a wanted criminal. "That's the vehicle. Officer," she declared with the authority of someone who'd never been told no in her life. "Parked illegally on HOA property for the third time this month." I watched from my kitchen window as Martinez walked the perimeter of my driveway, his boots crunching on the same gravel my grandfather had laid 60 years ago. Karen followed him like a prosecutor, presenting evidence, gesturing wildly at my truck, my barn, and the weathered fence posts that had marked our property line since before she was born. The deputy pulled out his notepad, glanced at the address on my mailbox, then looked back at Karen with the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I could see him shaking his head, his voice carrying across the evening air, as he explained something that made Karen's face flush red with indignation. That's when I knew she'd finally pushed too far. For months, she'd been testing boundaries, flexing her HOA authority like a badge, but calling the police on a man for parking on his own land? That crossed a line that even her twisted interpretation of property law couldn't justify. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, ready to end this ridiculous theater, once and for all. My name is Tom Brennan, and I've lived on this 40-acre ranch in Copper Valley, Nevada, for the better part of 30 years. The land itself has been in my family since 1962, when my grandfather bought it from a failing cattle operation for what would be pocket change today. Back then, the valley was nothing but sagebrush, scattered ranches, and the kind of silence that city folks pay good money to experience for a weekend. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a dirt road, and the biggest controversy in town was whether the local diner's coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. I inherited the property when I was 28, fresh out of the Marines, and looking for a place to settle down with my wife Sarah and our newborn daughter Emma. The ranch house was modest but solid, built from local stone and timber that had weathered decades of high desert winters. We added a barn, fenced the property, and slowly built the kind of life that used to be the American dream: honest work, clear boundaries, and neighbors who minded their own business. The first sign of trouble came 15 years ago, when developers started eyeing the valley. They bought up the Henderson Place, then the old Murphy Ranch, promising to preserve the rural character while building luxury mountain estates. The Copper Valley Homeowners Association formed shortly after, initially just a handful of new residents who wanted to maintain property values and coordinate snow removal. I never joined. My land was grandfathered and legally separate from their development, and I had no interest in paying fees to an organization that would tell me what color to paint my barn. For over a decade, we coexisted peacefully. The HOA managed their gated community on the north side of the valley, and I ran my small cattle operation on the south side. Occasionally, their board president would drop by with a friendly suggestion about joining their community family, but it was always cordial, always respectful. That changed 3 years ago when Karen Whitmore moved into the biggest house in the development and immediately got herself elected to the HOA board. Karen was the kind of woman who treated every conversation like a hostile takeover bid. She'd moved to Nevada from some suburb in California, bringing with her a platinum blonde entitlement and an unshakable belief that rural life needed proper management. Within 6 months of her arrival, she'd convinced the HOA to adopt new, aesthetic guidelines that included restrictions on vehicle parking, livestock noise, and unsightly agricultural structures. The fact that none of these rules applied to my property didn't seem to register with her. The harassment started small. She'd drive by my ranch and take photos of my equipment, my livestock, even my mailbox. She sent certified letters claiming my cattle were degrading the neighborhood ambiance, and my pickup truck was an eyesore visible from the road. When I didn't respond to her letters, she escalated to the county, filing noise complaints about my cattle and zoning violations for my barn. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but the message was clear. Karen Whitmore had decided that my ranch was her problem to solve. The war began in earnest last spring, when Karen decided my driveway was actually HOA property. According to her interpretation of the county plat maps, a 20-foot strip of land along the main road belonged to the homeowners association, which meant my driveway entrance was technically on their property. She presented this theory to the HOA board with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor who just discovered DNA evidence, complete with color-coded maps and a PowerPoint presentation about encroachment issues. The board, to their credit, initially told her to drop it. My neighbor Jim Patterson, who'd lived in the valley almost as long as I had, pointed out that my family had been using that driveway since before the HOA existed. But Karen had done her homework. She'd found an obscure provision in the county records that showed a utility easement along the Rodan, easement that technically belonged to the homeowners association as part of their development agreement. Within a month, she'd convinced the board to send me an official notice, demanding I relocate my driveway 30 feet to the east, onto what she called confirmed private property. The letter arrived on HOA letterhead, signed by their lawyer, giving me 60 days to comply or face legal action. I read it twice, then called my old friend Dave Hernandez, who'd been practicing property law in Nevada for 20 years. Dave laughed when I read him the letter. "Tom, that easement is for utility access only. They can't restrict your driveway unless they can prove it interferes with power lines or water mains. And even then, they'd need to compensate you for the inconvenience." He agreed to send a response letter explaining the legal realities, but warned me that HOA disputes had a way of getting expensive fast. Karen's response to Dave's letter was to double down. She hired a surveyor to map the exact boundaries of the easement, then installed a chain across my driveway with a sign that read, "Private HOA property, no trespassing." I cut the chain the same day and kept the sign as evidence of her escalating harassment. That's when she started calling the police. Every time I parked my truck in my own driveway, Karen would call the sheriff's office and report illegal parking on HOA property. The first time, Deputy Rodriguez came out and politely explained that my driveway was clearly on my property and I could park wherever I wanted. The second time, Deputy Chen took photos of my property markers and told Karen to stop wasting the department's time. But Karen was persistent. She called every few days, sometimes multiple times per day, reporting various violations: illegal parking, noise complaint, trespassing, even claiming I'd threatened her during a conversation where I'd simply asked her to stay off my property. The sheriff's office started sending different deputies each time, hoping to avoid the appearance of harassment. But the message was clear. Karen Whitmore had turned my driveway into her personal crusade. The breaking point came when she convinced 2 other HOA board members to join her in a citizen's arrest attempt. I was loading feed into my truck when Karen, accompanied by HOA President Michelle Torres and Treasurer Brad Hoffman, marched up my driveway with a video camera and a printed copy of what she claimed was a restraining order. "Sir, you are trespassing on homeowners association property," Karen announced to the camera. "We are making a citizen's arrest pending arrival of law enforcement." I stood there, holding a 50-pound bag of cattle feed, looking at 3 suburban residents who'd apparently lost their minds. "Karen, you're on my property," I said calmly. "You're the one trespassing." But she was committed to her performance, describing my illegal occupation of HOA land, while Michelle looked increasingly uncomfortable, and Brad kept glancing toward the road like he was expecting backup. The police arrived within 10 minutes. Karen had called them before starting her citizen's arrest theater. Deputy Martinez took one look at the situation and immediately separated us. He spent 15 minutes explaining property law to Karen, while I provided him with copies of my deed, survey maps, and Dave's legal correspondence. By the time he left, Michelle and Brad were apologizing profusely and promising to reconsider the HOA's position. Karen, however, remained defiant. As the deputy drove away, she pointed at my truck and declared, "This isn't over, Brennan. That vehicle is parked on HOA property, and I'll prove it in court." That night, she called the police again, reporting that I'd returned to the scene of my supposed trespassing. Deputy Martinez came back out, took one look at my truck in my driveway, and told Karen he'd arrest her for false reporting if she called again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork that represented 3 decades of legal ownership, property deeds, survey maps, tax records, utility, bills, everything that proved my ranch belonged to me and my family. But as I reviewed the documents, something caught my eye that I'd never noticed before. A small notation on the original 1962 survey map, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, county road easement, 50 feet from center line. I pulled out my phone and called Dave Hernandez at home. Dave, I need you to look at something. That utility easement Karen's been claiming, what exactly does it cover? He promised to review the county records first thing in the morning, but I had a feeling I already knew what he'd find. The next morning, Dave called me back with news that made me smile for the first time in months. Tom, that easement is for a proposed county road that was never built. The development agreement gave the HOA responsibility for maintaining it, but the county retained ownership. More importantly, the easement only covers utility access power, water, sewer. Vehicle access is specifically excluded, which means Karen's entire legal theory is based on a misunderstanding of county law. But the real kicker came when Dave dug deeper into the HOA's corporate structure. Here's something interesting, he said. The HOA's development agreement requires them to maintain public access to that easement by blocking your driveway. They're actually violating their own charter. And get this, the county has the right to revoke their management agreement if they interfere with legitimate property access. I asked Dave to prepare a formal legal response, but I also had an idea of my own. If Karen wanted to play legal games, I'd give her a masterclass in property law. I called my old Marine buddy, Mike Santos, who'd become a private investigator after leaving the service. Mike, I need a favor. I want to document every single time Karen Whitmore has trespassed on my property, harassed my neighbors, or filed false police reports. Can you help me build a case? Mike spent the next 2 weeks conducting what he called surveillance and documentation. He interviewed my neighbors, collected police reports, and even obtained recordings of Karen's calls to the sheriff's office through a public records request. What he found was a pattern of harassment that went far beyond property disputes. Karen had been systematically targeting anyone in the valley who didn't conform to her vision of suburban perfection. She'd filed complaints against the Murphy family for their chicken coop, threatened legal action against the Hendersons for their vegetable garden, and even tried to get old Pete Gonzalez fined for parking his vintage Mustang in his own driveway. The pattern was clear. Karen Whitmore had appointed herself the unofficial dictator of Copper Valley, and she was using HOA authority to enforce her personal preferences. The perfect opportunity for justice came when Karen made her biggest mistake yet. Emboldened by what she perceived as support from the county, she decided to escalate her harassment to a new level. She convinced the HOA board to hire a private security company to patrol the easement and issue citations for any violations of their parking ordinance. The security guard, a kid named Tyler, who couldn't have been more than 22, showed up on a Tuesday morning with a clipboard and a badge that looked like it came from a cereal box. He knocked on my door and informed me that I was parked illegally and needed to move my truck immediately or face further legal action. I invited him inside for coffee and asked to see his credentials. Tyler was nervous but polite, explaining that he'd been hired by the HOA to enforce parking regulations along the county easement. When I asked him if he understood the difference between a utility easement and public property, he admitted he'd never heard of either concept. Look, see, I'm just doing what they pay me to do, he said. Mrs. Whitmore said, "You've been trespassing, and I need to document it." That's when I knew Karen had stepped over the line from harassment into potential criminal behavior. I called Dave Hernandez and asked him to contact the county attorney's office immediately. Dave, they've hired private security to enforce non-existent parking regulations on county property. That's got to be illegal impersonation or something similar. Dave's response was everything I'd hoped for. Tom, that's exactly what we need. Hiring private security to enforce fake regulations on public property is a clear violation of county law. And if they're doing it under the authority of the HOA, That's corporate malfeasance. We can go after both Karen personally and the HOA as an organization. The trap was set. I asked Tyler to wait outside while I called the sheriff's office. When Deputy Martinez arrived, I explained the situation and provided him with copies of all the legal documents Dave had prepared. Martinez took one look at Tyler's fake security badge and Karen's written instructions about parking enforcement and immediately called for backup. Karen arrived 20 minutes later, expecting to find Tyler issuing me a citation. Instead, she found 3 deputy sheriffs, a county attorney, and her private security guard in handcuffs. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Tyler was just doing his job. County Attorney Lisa Chang stepped forward with a folder full of legal documents. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're under arrest for criminal impersonation, harassment, and violation of county ordinances regarding private security on public property. You have the right to remain silent." The look on Karen's face as the handcuffs clicked shut was worth every month of harassment I'd endured. She kept protesting that she was protecting HOA property, that she had legal authority, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. Recorded phone calls, documented trespassing, false police reports, and now criminal impersonation. As they loaded Karen into the patrol car, I noticed several of my neighbors watching from their driveways. Jim Patterson gave me a thumbs up. The Henderson family actually applauded. Even Michelle Torres, who'd initially supported Karen's crusade, looked relieved that the nightmare was finally over. The legal consequences for Karen Whitmore were swift and severe. The county attorney's office had been building a case against her for months, using the false police reports and harassment complaints as evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior. The private security incident was just the final piece they needed to file formal charges. Karen was charged with 3 felonies: criminal impersonation, harassment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. She was also hit with multiple misdemeanors for false reporting, trespassing, and violating county ordinances. The bail was set at $50. Ling, which her husband paid, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. The HOA board immediately distanced themselves from Karen's actions, claiming they'd been misled about the legal basis for her parking enforcement scheme. Michelle Torres resigned as president, stating that she'd been manipulated by false legal advice and wanted to focus on healing the community. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position and issued a formal apology to all residents who'd been harassed. But the civil consequences were even more satisfying. Dave Hernandez filed a lawsuit against both Karen personally and the HOA as an organization, seeking damages for harassment, emotional distress, and legal fees. The HOA's insurance company settled immediately, paying $75 to avoid a public trial. Karen's personal assets were frozen, pending the outcome of her criminal case. The county also took action against the HOA itself. The development agreement that gave them management authority over the utility easement was revoked, and the county assumed direct control of all public access issues. A new county ordinance was passed specifically prohibiting private organizations from enforcing parking regulations on public property. Karen's criminal trial became a sensation in the local media. The story of a HOA board member who'd hired fake security to harass her neighbors resonated with anyone who'd ever dealt with overzealous homeowners associations. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including many of Karen's former victims who'd come to watch justice being served. The prosecution presented a devastating case: phone recordings of Karen's false police reports, video footage of her trespassing on my property, testimony from multiple neighbors about her harassment, and documentation of her conspiracy to violate county ordinances. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray her as a concerned citizen who'd been overzealous in protecting property values, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Karen was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay $150 in restitution to her victims, and banned from serving on any HOA board in the state of Nevada. As the judge read the sentence, Karen finally broke down. The entitled suburban tyrant who'd terrorized an entire valley was reduced to tears as she realized the full consequences of her actions. Her husband filed for divorce the next week, citing irreconcilable differences, and put their house up for sale. Today, Copper Valley is peaceful again. The new HOA board operates with transparency and respect for property rights, focusing on legitimate community issues like road maintenance and fire safety. They even established a community garden where Karen once tried to ban vegetables. And the annual barbecue brings together neighbors who'd been divided by her harassment campaign. My ranch remains exactly as it was, 40 acres of high desert peace where I can park my truck in my own driveway without fear of false arrests. The cattle graze contentedly, and the morning coffee tastes better, knowing that justice has been served. Emma brings her kids out to visit their great-grandfather's land, and they run through the same fields where I played as a child. The legal precedent set by Karen's case has had effects far beyond our small valley. HOA reform advocates across Nevada point to the Whitmore case as proof that homeowners associations can't operate above the law. Several other HOA board members have been prosecuted for similar harassment campaigns. And the state legislature is considering new regulations to prevent future abuse. Sometimes I drive past the house where Karen used to live, now occupied by a retired teacher who waves. When she sees me, the chain that once blocked my driveway is gone, replaced by a small sign that reads, "Welcome to Copper Valley, population, people who mind their own business." It's a joke, but it captures something important about the community we've rebuilt. Karen Whitmore learned the hard way that property rights aren't suggestions, and that calling yourself an authority doesn't make you one. She thought she could use fear and harassment to control people who'd lived in the valley longer than she'd been alive. Instead, she discovered that rural communities have their own way of dealing with bullies, and that justice, while sometimes slow, is absolutely certain. The lesson is simple: respect your neighbor's property, mind your own business, and remember that even the smallest ranch can become a fortress when defended by people who understand the true meaning of American freedom.